Hi, and welcome to lecture number 15. This is the second part of our intro to the Middle East, where we started off talking about two themes in the Middle East. The first theme being the Saudi-Iran Cold War, and then today we will take a look at the Israeli-Arab conflict. Let's take a quick look at the map, though. Here we have Iran. Get my pen here. Here we have Iran, and here we have Saudi Arabia. Okay, these are two powerhouses in the Middle East. These are the two that have got a Cold War going, not actually fighting each other, but fighting against proxy wars in other countries. So we learned about Iran here. Not very neat. And Saudi Arabia here. One of the places they fought was this country right here. This is Iraq. This is Iraq. This is a country the United States has been involved with. First became involved with when they invaded little Kuwait, right down here, Kuwait. So when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the Americans got involved and pushed them out in the first Gulf War, second Gulf War. We went ahead and conquered the rest of Iraq. But we have to talk about that later. Just want you to remember these countries. We have Iran up here, Saudi Arabia here, Iraq here, and little Kuwait right down there. Okay. We're going to take a look at now the second theme of our talk about the Middle East, and that is the Arab-Israeli conflict. Let's zoom in a little bit here and take a look at Israel and its surrounding neighbors. Israel is this little country right here. Little tiny country, but has had an outsized influence in the world. Its neighbors are Egypt over here. Here we have the little tiny country of Lebanon. Here we have Syria, which is considerably bigger. The Israeli-Syrian border is just this little bit right in here. Over here we have Jordan. And then we also have the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which we will talk about tomorrow. Okay, I want to show you just a little video clip, gives a little bit of history to what's going on with Israel and its neighbors. So let's take a look at that right now.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but But as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states. One for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan, and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the U.S.-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle.
And that is something that we will take a look at tomorrow. But for now, I want to just take a look at the map and talk about those countries that are surrounding Israel. So here we have Israel in the blue. It controls the West Bank and Gaza Strip. To the north, we have Lebanon. We have Lebanon. Israel and Lebanon have fought several times against each other. In the south part of Lebanon, there is a group called Hezbollah that has very anti-Israeli and has fought, like I say, several wars and conflicts there. Over here, we have Syria. Okay, so we got Lebanon up here. We have Syria over here. What Israel took from Syria is this section right here. This is called the Golan Heights. Now, the Golan Heights are very strategic. From the Golan Heights, you can look out over the entire northern plain of Israel. And the Israelis saw that Syrian gunners up there could sit up there and pot shot at all kinds of stuff out here. There was one of the reasons that they seized the Golan Heights, simply to make the country more defensible. The other one is not really talked about a whole lot. The Jordan River runs down here sorry, down here along the border. Jordan River is very important to Israel and to Jordan, but Syria controlled the Golan Heights, where much of the water that feeds into the Jordan River came from. And there was a big concern among the Israelis that the Syrians could try to divert that water. It's a possibility, never came about. Down here, of course, we have Egypt, and Egypt was the first country to make peace with Israel. Over here, we have Jordan. Jordan is an interesting country. Jordan is in an area that is surrounded by conflict and problems. Lebanon has huge amounts of problems. Fighting with Israel worked against them. They are a multi-religion, multi-party state that just seems to constantly be fighting with each other. And then just about a month ago, the capital, Beirut, about half of it was leveled when they had a huge explosion. The explosion came from a bunch of chemicals that had been stored for several years in a warehouse there. And it was very explosive stuff, caught fire and leveled half the city. Lebanon is an unhappy place. Syria is even worse off. During the Arab Spring, Syria, there was protests against the Syrian government. The Syrian government responded very harshly, and the protests turned into a rebellion, which has been going on for a decade. The Syrians have just about won this war, but there's still fighting going on, and it is still a wreck of a country. Down here we have Jordan. Jordan is a major exception of the catastrophic problems that so much of the Middle East has. Jordan is doing very well for itself. And Jordan has a king, and Jordan has made peace with Israel, and Jordan has basically stayed out of all the problems that are all the way around it. Because of this stability, foreigners have seen fit to invest in Jordan. Lots of American companies have invested there to serve the markets in the Middle East. They're not going to build a factory in Syria. It'll get bombed and torn apart. They're not going to build one in Lebanon. They are building them in Jordan, which has a very well-educated, hardworking population. This is one of the things Jordan has going for it. Another thing is they have developed medical tourism. Now, medical tourism is probably not something you've heard about, but medical tourism basically is where you go to another country to get an operation or some kind of medical help because that country can do it so much cheaper. We have that going on in the United States. There is medical tourism from the United States all the way to India. Some people that have a medical procedure that they need to do will fly to India. They'll take a few days. They'll see the sights. They'll make it a vacation. They will get their operation. They will spend a couple days recovery. Then they will fly home to the United States. And it is still much cheaper than having that same operation in the United States. The doctors are highly competent. This has been going on for years down on the California-Mexico border. All you have to do is go across the border into Mexico, and first thing you see is a big line of dentist shops and doctors' offices and pharmacies. You can get your drugs and your medical procedures done so much cheaper just across the border. So there's lots of Americans that go south to do that. There are even some American insurance companies that will lower your premiums if you will agree to go to another country for major operations. This is medical tourism, and this is something that Jordan has done a big deal with to help keep their economy up and going. To its credit, Jordan has done some amazing things with taking in refugees. They've taken in about 1 million refugees out of Syria, Muslim taken in lots of Christians out of Iraq where they're feeling unsafe. And then they have lots of Palestinians. Well, the Palestinians have been there for so long, they basically have given them citizenship and now consider them to be part of Jordan. So this is the beginning, or this is the Arab-Israeli conflict in a nutshell. There is still a lot of animosity in the Arab world against Israel. However, in just the last week, actually last night, you saw on the news an easing of the tension. United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have both signed an agreement with Israel that they're going to get along. Now, this is more of a trade agreement. They haven't actually been at war, but you're starting to see a breaking of the ranks amongst the Arab population, the Muslim population, against Israel. Could this be a precursor to peace? Maybe, maybe not. They've been fighting since 1948, so nobody's holding their breath, but it's a hopeful sign. Okay. So tomorrow we're going to take a look at Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. This is a very emotional, in some circles, state of affairs, and we will talk about it tomorrow. So have a good day. See you later.